this is where the rubber meets the road, is that we're trying to generate these adaptations in the brain, adaptations in the nervous system, you might say, adaptations of the heart and the cardiovascular system, and then, of course, the adaptations at the muscular level. And it's a two-edged sword, because the same stimuli that is going to turn on molecular signals, it's also going to turn on stress responses, whether it's bone tendon stress, and muscle damage, the repetitive autonomic nervous system stress load, immunosuppression, inflammatory responses, and so forth. We're learning that inflammatory responses can get out of control. They can kill you. Cytokine storms are one of the key killers of the COVID-19 response. The body can go overboard on some of its protective responses, and that includes inflammation. And inflammation happens, for example, with endurance training. So these are all issues, and we're trying to we're hobby molecular biologists as coaches, even though we don't maybe know it, because we're trying to move that fulcrum a little bit in different directions to try to get the balance right between stimulus and stress and make it sustainable. Then we're back to that words, is this sustainable? And so the question then becomes, for me, so why so much green zone? Why is it that we see so consistently that really successful athletes are doing a lot of training that seems like they could go harder and maybe become more efficient in the sense of using less time at a lot and get more stimuli at a higher intensity? And my current 20-year summation of the answer to that is here. That number one, on the signal side, intensity is not the only component of the stimuli. It's really important to understand that at the molecular level, it's intensity times duration. There is if you think in math terms, it's an area under the curve you're trying to generate. You're trying to find the right combination. So intensity is just a one-dimensional variable. It only has meaning when you add the duration component. And that's a really important kind of fundamental for us to have our heads around as coaches and athletes, is that 90% of VO2 max means nothing until I attach a time to it. How long am I there? How many accumulated minutes am I at 90% or at 65%? That's when it begins to have meaning as an adaptive signal. Now, another issue is energy availability. We know that the relative utilization of our different energy sources, fats, carbohydrates, and so forth, change with intensity. And it may well be that one of the sustainability issues is just this daily glycogen load or glycogen demand. And it may be that part of the sustainability issue is achieving or using a lower intensity that generates a signal without hitting against a glycogen limitation every day. And then the third component is just the stress load management, is systemic stress load. How are we managing that and the different components of that stress load? And those components vary depending on the sport. For example, running, the ballistic load, the muscle tendon load, is higher than it would be for swimming or for cycling. Whereas with cycling, because we're able to do these longer rides, these longer sessions, we may be seeing a different autonomic system stress load because we are driving the autonomic nervous system for longer periods, often with our 6-hour training sessions as cyclists. So there are some differences, but there's an overall stress management issue that we have to attend to. And that ends up being my basic way of looking at sustainable training is I'm trying to, every time I plan a training week or 10-day cycle for my daughter, it's this. It's signal stress and trying to get that balance right for her, or help her to get it right through our communication and through her execution of the training prescription. And I love this picture because I think it just summarizes in an interesting way the realities of training and competition. And that is that, obviously the key stress we're thinking about is the actual stress of the physiological demand of cycling for 5 hours or doing the 7, 8, 9 hour triathlon or whatever. But there are a bunch of other stress components that can add up to a breakdown situation. And, when we look at, say, a grand tour, the athletes do fine, and then they fall, they get some bruises and scrub sores or these injuries, these abrasions, which in isolation are not catastrophic, but they tip the athlete over the edge from a total stress load situation. And often this will result in a capitulation 2 or 3 days later, because now they're not sleeping, they're not recovering, and they just say, no more, I'm done, I'm out. And so this is kind of an encapsulation of what happens to us as normal age groupers that have jobs and have, other sources of stress. Is we have to remember that the brain and the body kind of, the total stress load is one big pot. The stress responses, whether it's because of lack of sleep or because of concern over a job or a training load, often they go through some common pathways. So we have to manage the total stress and be cognizant of that. When we're working with age group or school athletes, we have to think, if they're in a period of heavy school load, heavy exam load, that actually ends up impacting their physiological responses to the training. So, I'll end with this, or at least on this particular talk, is, when you have your athlete or you yourself and you've made a decision, today is an extensive day, it's a green zone day, are you going to be true to that when you hit this hill? When you're jogging along and the hill comes? This is one of those fundamental behavioral decisions that we see that high performance athletes are good at. Intensity discipline, at toning down the intensity as they run up that hill, because today is a low intensity day. Are you going to be able to control your instinct, the instinct I have every time some cyclist passes me on the road or on Zwift? I instinctively want to say, I'm on your tail. I'm going to, well, this half wheeling has destructive effects on our overall long-term training if we don't keep it under control. So this is, intensity discipline is part physiology, but it's a whole lot psychology. And I'll leave you with that on this first session. The problem is that perfect training plans, the idea of that if we structure everything, then we push the button in essence and just execute the training plan, that everything's going to work. Well, the problem is those perfect training plans meet a biological reality that is very different from building a house or a garage or adding remodeling your kitchen, because there are some complexities that are not present. There's a difference between complex and complicated. And one of the things that you meet when you coach is that this happens. Stuff happens and people fall down, they get hurt. Speed skaters, I used to work with speed skaters. A speed skater falls and gets a concussion 2 months before the Olympic trials. Well, that just kind of throws a monkey wrench in the works of your well thought out training plan. And then you got to adapt on the fly. And the other thing that happens, even if none of this happens, even if no major catastrophes happen, no infections, broken bones, or crashes, you just have these issues, which are these so-called butterfly effects, or small things that have big consequences over time, sometimes unforeseen, that make the planning process much more challenging than we would like it to be. Because the training process that worked last year, for some reason, is giving a different outcome this year. What has changed? It's not always easy to understand. I recently listened to this lecture by Tim Palmer. He's a mathematics professor. I'm not a mathematics expert, but I was interested in this issue of planning, of periodization and prediction. And he, and I read the book Chaos way back when I was a doctoral student. And yeah, it was a life-changing experience for me to think about things in a different way. But he was explaining here why it is that despite the incredible computational power that we have, the incredible degree of processing power we have, we still, for example, cannot predict the weather with any kind of accuracy at the local level beyond about 10 days out. No matter how sophisticated you work with the models, the degree of refinement that you achieve with successive layers of complexity or complication in the details just gives less and less of a benefit in your predictive value. And so we're stuck with this. Well, what struck me as a sports scientist was that that's not that different of a number. If I try to say, well, if I'm planning the training for my daughter and everything's going well, how far into the future can I predict and plan very precisely which workouts I want her to do? And I end up basically in the same situation, is that a 10-day cycle is kind of about where I am. I will sometimes plan 2 10-day or 9-day cycles we use, but that's about as far in front as we go, because experience shows that things are going to happen, that small details will require that we make adjustments. And so there's not a whole lot of added value to very detailed planning beyond that window. So it's not that different from predicting the weather. Even though I don't have a supercomputer, I'm dealing with some of the same issues of complexity and butterfly effects as a coach. And that is just a reality. And so this guy, Rick Nason, he wrote this book, It's Not Complicated, where he kind of tries to distinguish between complicated processes, which have lots of moving parts, but they are predictable. They do not have feedback loops and so forth that cause them to spin out of control, versus complexity, which is where you have unforeseen consequences from small changes. And to be honest, coaching is complex. It's managing complexity. And so he presents this kind of the prayer, kind of an adaptation of the serenity prayer. And he says, give me the serenity to accept the things that cannot be calculated, the courage to calculate the things that can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think this is going to resonate for us when we start to think about things like, measuring training load and how we quantify different things, and some of our algorithms that we put our faith in is to what extent those calculations are valid. But we'll get back to that. Now, if you're facing some of this stuff on the left side, the shit, and you're also dealing with butterfly effects, what are your tools? Well, your tools then are that you have to communicate. You have to use this interaction. And personally, people ask me, can you coach me? And I say, well, no, I don't have time, number one. And number two, I don't think I could do justice to the coaching process as a purely digital experience, because I find that coaching we still benefit from looking each other in the eyes. We still benefit from seeing the athlete and talking and getting that emotive, those responses, to try to understand how they are doing. So communication still matters. And that helps us to deal with some of this complexity and some of the unfortunate stuff that happens. And we have to revise. We have to realize that those coaching plans are going to be constantly under revision. And that's part of the art of this science, that there is still art there. There is still a degree of intuition and a gestalt process that so far the science is not replaced. And I'm a scientist, and I'm just telling you that we don't have the scientific data to make this process foolproof or artificially intelligence driven. So your jobs as coaches, they're not very highly paid, but they're still safe in the sense that we can't replace you with just pure data. So obviously there's some religious connotations here, but I don't want to get too religious. But I do think that the Trinity has value in the sense that it's also in the idea of government, which is that this idea of checks and balances, that if you just measure one thing, such as power or pace, and there are those who prescribe that, who say, look, all I need to measure is power. If I know my power zones, then I got all I need. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not true, because power is the result of, pace is the result of the physiology that you're trying to manipulate with your training. So it is not the cause, it's an effect. I want to also know physiological responses, and I want to know perceptual responses, because the brain ultimately controls all of this, and the brain is the canary in the coal mine. The perceptions of effort, those are the first that tend to change when it starts going sideways in the training process. So the Trinity, for me, of monitoring is these three in concert. I want to know the external loads that are being executed, that are being successfully achieved. That is part of the developmental data that I need. But I also, in the day-to-day process, I want to know some physiological responses. Heart rate is kind of our window, our easiest, most accessible window into that physiological machinery. It's not perfect. There are caveats, there are issues that you need to be clear about, but it is an important window. And then occasionally we may also use blood lactate. We may occasionally also bring people into the laboratory, although I think you can produce gold medal winners without a laboratory. Don't get me wrong. We've done it. It's been done by, in many places. But some measurements of physiology are important. And then that perceptual effort, if it's my daughter, she just uses her pros in her training diary. She doesn't necessarily use a lot of numbers. I like some numbers, but she is touchy-feely based, and that's fine. She's listening to her body well, and then I try to translate what she says perceptually to some of the physiology, and it gives a checks and balances system that works. In government, it's supposed to be this way too. Unfortunately, it tends to fall apart in some governments with the wrong leaders.